Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another night with Null 404. Today we're going to be talking with Obi-Wan and his breaking revocation, fixing a broken trust model with Bloom filters, talk on certificate revocation, and all the fun stuff behind that. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsor, ArcLight 6. You guys are awesome. We're having some fun CTF challenges coming along, sponsored by them. More to follow. Obi-Wan, all you, my friend.
All right. Thank you for the kind introduction. And like was already mentioned, my talk today is going to be on Bloom filters and certificate revocation. So this may not come across in cyberspace as well as it does in MateSpace, but I'm very tall. I get a lot of typical questions. My height is 5 feet and 22 inches. No, I don't play basketball. My shoe size is 15. And the weather is fine up here, but if I'm outside and someone asks that, I'll spit and say it's raining. Now, professionally, I'm a staff software engineer, and last year I got my CISSP after studying for 2 weeks. Passed that exam at the minimum number of questions. And I am also a musician, so I play the ocarina. I should probably actually have my Discord window up so I can see if it's in frame. That'd be smart. And I'll just play a couple of bars to give you a little sampling of what it sounds like. So that's with 0 warm-ups. I apologize for flubbing a little bit of a note there, but
Awesome.
gives you a sample. And now I really have no real reason to keep my camera on, so I'll switch that off. So if anyone wants to get in touch later, my website is mattthetall.site. I have a Linktree page, and that's got various means you can reach out and say hello. And before I get into the fun technical side of things, I first came across this comic years ago via a podcast I listened to. And it's a nice example of the opposite of when you're dealing with a lot of technical things with computers. There's no miracles here. It's all, mathematics, programming, and human understandable. So to set some expectations here, the goals are you'll have an understanding of the importance of certificates, what the issues are with certificate revocation, what Bloom filters are and how they work, and how cascading them will give you some pretty cool effects. Now, for some nomenclature, I'll cover some of the basics here. It's also worth noting that this is not work that I have been a part of building. I found out about this project that Firefox has been working on last year, and they've been working on this since, I think it was late 2019. And last I heard, I think they've moved what I'll be talking about today into the beta. I know for sure it's in Firefox Nightly, but I haven't checked as much on how far in the release cycle it's gone beyond that. So, covering some of the nomenclature here, we'll start with our asymmetric ciphers. So you might know this as public-private key cryptography. Some good examples here are RSA, elliptic curve crypto, Diffie-Hellman, and big surprise, it's a crucial technology in keeping the web secure. So this uses 2 linked keys, one is public, one is private, and it's worth noting as well that it's very slow. So usually this is only going to be used on a small piece of information, whether it's well, generally speaking, it's going to be a symmetric key that you're going to encrypt that you would then use for your bulk encryption. So another thing that's worth knowing about here is a cryptographic hash. So this is a lossy process. Any size of the input that you put into this, the output length is always going to be the same. So you could take, say, the entirety of Wikipedia, run it through a hash, let's say it's SHA-256, you're going to get 256 bits back, whether it's the whole of Wikipedia or a single character you feed in there. And if you change a single bit of your input, each output bit has a 50% chance of flipping. So in other words, you could have 2 very similar inputs and you're going to get completely different hashes when you're talking about a cryptographic hash. Now, digital signatures are another thing worth knowing about here. These are a way to prove ownership of a private key. Uses your asymmetric cryptography. The way this works is if you take some piece of data and you encrypt it with your private key, anyone who has your public key can verify that you have the corresponding private key, and you don't need to give up your private key to do so. And like I already mentioned before on asymmetric ciphers more generally, you're going to be doing this on a small piece of data. Now, digital certificates are a big surprise going to be a big topic in this talk. For convenience, I just refer to these as certs or certificates. Depends on, how many syllables you want to save. These are electronic credentials that prove identity. So this would be your website will provide their certificate to identify themselves, proving that you have some reason to actually trust they're going to be halfway decent with your data in between your computer and their servers. Now, certificate authorities are entities that underpin our PKI, or public key infrastructure on the web. They are trusted entities that assert a website or company as who they say they are, and these organizations facilitate authentication and confidentiality when we communicate online. Now, it's also worth mentioning here as well that certificate authorities do have a very trusted position in our computers. If it doesn't matter if you're talking about your phone, your desktop, whatever else, there is a collection of certificates that are root certificates that all of our devices trust by default unless you go in and remove them. And any certificate that is signed by one of those roots will be trusted by your machine. Now, worth mentioning some certificate anatomy here. So the public key is what's going to be used to encrypt your initial contact with a server. The CA signature takes data from what's called a certificate signing request, and they will use this they will sign this with the private key of that CA to validate that the certificate, how to put it, basically, this allows you to know that a trusted entity, aka the certificate authority, shows that the website has proven themselves to be who they say they are. There's different levels of validation that are available. So you've got a domain validation certificate, for instance. If you've ever used Let's Encrypt, that's using domain validation. You put a little piece of data in your DNS listing for your website, it automatically goes and verifies that and then issues you a certificate. There are other more stringent verification methods out there as well, where extended validation is usually what you tend to hear about, and that'll be used for, say, larger companies that want a little bit of an extra assertion that they are who they say they are. And the certificate authorities will validate, say, they have a physical address, that their phone number for the office they answer to, etc. And you're going to have your thumbprint on your certificate here. So this is a hash of the entire contents of the certificate, and this is globally unique. This will factor in later. You have your validity dates. So another thing worth mentioning here is certificates do eventually die off if their security gets compromised. But even these days, with shorter-lived certificates, that can still be up to a year. And then worth mentioning as well, we have our identifying information that's in the certificate. So your recipient's common name, domain names, and more. So before we get into the fun of revocation, we've got a little bit of how certificates are created. So it starts off when a public key and a private key love each other very much. Terrible joke, I know, but at any rate, you've got your applicant here, and I keep forgetting. PowerPoint has a fun little laser pointer I can use to actually highlight things on screen for you. So you got your applicant side here and the certificate authority. So you may note that both of these entities do not disclose their private key when you are trying to get yourself a certificate. Basically, you take your identifying information that gets uh, associated with your public key and you use that to generate a certificate signing request. That then goes to your authority. They validate your identity through whatever means, like we covered before, and then they will use their private key to generate a signed certificate, and then they send that back to you. Now, for a little extra background here, we've got our fun little visualization of an SSL TLS handshake. And this will start off with, say, your browser reaching out to the server. They'll send a client hello. Server will respond with their server hello. And then they will present their digital certificate to the browser. The browser will then take that certificate and validate the cryptography to make sure that it is a valid certificate. And then they will create an encrypted pre-master secret and send that to the server. The server will then decrypt the pre-master secret using their private key and then compute the key that's going to be used for the session. Now, what happens if your private key gets loose? Well, things get on fire. Probably not something you want to have happen, but it does sometimes happen, and that's why revocation is a thing. So there are some legitimate use cases for this. You could have a security incident, you could have a key compromise, or it even could just be a service change. Let's say you change what cloud provider you're using. You might want to reissue your keys just to play it safe. So we got some real world examples here that I can point you to. So Komodo, I think it was in 2011. They are I think were, I believe, a root CA, and they ended up issuing a few certificates to a malicious actor. Those certs were for sites like the login page for Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo's email. And then another example here we've got is more recent. The Medusa ransomware uses a bring your own vulnerable driver attack that utilizes a driver that is signed by a revoked certificate. Now, fun little backstory about this slide here. When I was playing with a little AI tool to generate something to make it look a little prettier, it kept wanting to give me pictures of the African savanna. And when I presented this talk at DEF CON 858, someone pointed out, oh, it's because you've got the word Safari in here for the browser. So the problem that's still an issue as of today, I actually did double check. Certificate revocation is broken in most browsers. So Firefox and Vivaldi are the only browsers that I'm aware of at this point that actively query for OCSP status before they load a page. And I will define that acronym for you a little further in. Uh, it's worth mentioning too that if you are on iOS, Apple makes all the other browsers, with the potential exception of the EU. I remember there being some interesting back and forth in the legal system about actually letting other browsers bring their own engines. But for us here in the United States, for instance, um, Apple makes all of their browsers use the Safari engine. So if you're using, Chrome or Firefox on iOS, it's really just a reskinned version of Safari. And unfortunately, Safari and Chrome do not correctly check for revocation. If you want to test this with your own browser, you can go to revoked.grc.com. That website's run by Steve Gibson. He's been running a security podcast for over a decade, and the revocation issue definitely ruffled his feathers to the point where his website, Google, when he first set it up, actually pinned the certificate that he had revoked for his website and put it in Chrome so that it would correctly check that it was revoked. But then Steve went about and got a new certificate issued, revoked that one, and well, if you go to his website in Firefox, you'll get a page like this, which is what you want. It'll say, hey, you've got a revoked certificate for this website, you don't want to proceed. If you go in Chrome, Brave, Safari, etc., you'll get this page here that gives you a nice little read on certificates and why revocation is important. So for a little background here, there's been a few different ways that certificate revocation has been handled. So this started out with what are called CRLs, or certificate revocation lists. So these are large, they're inefficient, they're slow, and browsers eventually stopped downloading them. OCSP is kind of a current standard. Firefox uses this. You can even, if I'm remembering correctly, change a setting in your browser to go and make it so it will refuse to load a page if the OCSP check fails. I'll cover a little more detail on that in a bit here. But it's an unreliable protocol with a high failure rate, and there's imperfect network conditions that can cause extra issues there. So the solution I'll be going into more detail on today is what's called CRL Lite. So this is from Mozilla, and they've been working on getting this ready for production for a few years, and it's a very cool little system that does revocation checking locally. So this just goes into a little more detail in the certificate revocation list. Like I mentioned, they're slow, they're not fun to use, and they're only checked for extended validation certificates, which are a minority of what get issued. And they also fail open. Now, failing open in this case means if the check for revocation fails, your browser is going to automatically trust it. So OCSP, or the Online Certificate Status Protocol, has its own reliability challenges. So these numbers I pulled from Mozilla: 7% timeout rate, and there's usually about 130 millisecond connection delay. And a lot of you, well, if you've ever read any stories about Google or other web providers speeding up their website where something like 100 milliseconds actually makes a difference for them for whether or not users will stay on the page. There are also some other concerns about OCSP. So it's vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks, and CAs could conceivably use their servers for OCSP to track users. And much like the CRL lists, it fails open. So unless you deliberately change the setting, that defaults to failing open. Now, CRL Lite is a little different. They use a really cool means of compressing their revocation data. It's updated quite frequently, and there are some neat performance gains too. Now, I mentioned a little bit before the potential for censorship being an issue with CAs. The plus side is that, as far as we know right now, there's been no instances of CAs doing this, but it never hurts to belt and suspenders when you're dealing with cryptography or security. So, the plus side too, of course, is if this was an issue, people operating their websites could always switch to a different CA if censorship were to happen. And Mozilla has mentioned they're prepared to use the root store policy to influence things if it were needed for some reason. So this is where we get into the fun stuff. You may have noticed in the title that there's a mention of bloom filters. So these were invented in 1970, so I don't know what the threshold would be for what's considered a classic data structure, but I'm willing to bet this might count. They are probabilistic, they are extremely resource efficient, and they are lossy too, but this factors into the efficiency. Now, bloom filters can have false positives, but they cannot have false negatives. And like I mentioned already, as you know, I've got my slide here, information lossy. So there are some very cool real-world applications of these things. CDNs use them. Akamai used bloom filters to prevent caching of what they called one-hit wonders, and those were tying up nearly 3/4 of their caching infrastructure. And so when they put bloom filters in front of their caches, they only cache them the second time a request comes in. You got database systems that use these as well. Google's Bigtable, Apache HBase, Cassandra, Postgres. These all use bloom filters to bypass unnecessary disk lookups. So the way that would work is you check, oh, does this particular piece of data already exist based on checking the bloom filter? If not, you don't need to go to the disk and waste extra resources. The Bing search engine uses multi-level hierarchical bloom filters for their search index. And the Ethereum blockchain uses bloom filters to quickly locate logs. So we've got a fun little example here. This is a toy example, but it'll give you a good understanding of how the bloom filters in CRL Lite work. So I'm going to use this example up at the top for this and the next two slides to give you a little visual reference. So we'll start off with a more simplified example. So you take your binary array in the middle here. Just imagine that there's 1,000,000 bits in this array. So you got your 0 or 1 for each entry. And then you take the first 20 bits of a certificate thumbprint. Now, the thumbprint hash I mentioned earlier, it's unique for every certificate. And one of the other neat things about using a cryptographic hash is all of the bits in that hash are equally significant. So, I don't see any real reason you might want to, but if you wanted to, you could start at the far end of the hash instead of the beginning. So, for starters, we'll take our 20 pseudo-random bits, and this will give us a number between 0 and basically, 2 to the 20th power. And you may think to yourself, if you're familiar with program, this looks a lot like a hash table, and you'd be right. But when you're talking bloom filters, we set more bits than that. So before we get to that point of it though, let's try adding more certificates here. So again, we've got 1,000,000 bits here, and let's say we add 100,000 certificates based on just that first 20 bits in the thumbprint. You might notice you'll quickly start to run into collisions because we filled up this bloom filter roughly 10%. So, a way around this birthday paradox where two certificates could have conceivably the same first 20 bits, we use more bits. So, we'll take a look at, say, x at the top here. This will give you a good visualization. So we take the first 20 bits of x, and we set a bit in our array here. Then we take the next 20 bits, and we set a different bit corresponding to that next portion of the certificate thumbprint. I mean, it could be the same bit, but regardless. And then we do that 3 more times. Now, by doing that, each certificate here is going to set up to 5 bits. And this is going to give us roughly 50% of space utilization in the Bloom filter. Now, I'm a little fuzzy on the mathematics, but from what I understand, that's about how full you want a Bloom filter to be to make good use of it without getting too many false positives. So let's use our little Bloom filter example here. Let's say we've got a certificate we want to check. So you take that first 20 bits, look up the first spot in the Bloom filter. So let's use W here as a fun example. So we take that first 20 bits, we see, oh, there's a 1. Okay, so we grab the next 20 bits. Check that location in our array here. That's also a 1. Okay, so far, it might be a revoked certificate here. Now we take our third bit, and that's a 0. We can stop right here. We know it's not in the Bloom filter, and we know it's not revoked because of it. Now, as mentioned earlier, though, it is worth noting that there is the potentiality of false positives, because if all 5 bits are true, that doesn't rule out whether or not the certificate is valid or not. And so, we can discuss a little more detail about the issue of false positives here. So, the occurrence, we've got all tested bits may be 1 due to collisions with other certificates. Now, our implication for this is you cannot definitively confirm with one Bloom filter whether a certificate's been revoked. And it's also worth mentioning that not all applications where you might want to use a Bloom filter have the same tolerance for false positives. When we're talking about something like certificate revocation, though, you may remember from that screenshot I had of Firefox that it does not let you get to the website. And so with certificate revocation, you do not want a false positive here. So that's where cascading these Bloom filters together comes in. So the way that Mozilla did this is they've got a first level that is trained on revoked certificates. So take your first, certificate that you're going to be checking for revocation. Okay, let's say that that all 5 of those bits in our example are set. So we go to the second level, and this is for false positive handling. So this is trained on valid certificates that false positive in that first level of the Bloom filters. And then if, let's say, we still get a confirmation that it should be within the revoked certificates collection here, we've got a third level that is the final verification. There's a white paper that Mozilla has on this where you can go into the mathematics and whatnot, but the idea is that you only need these 3 levels of Bloom filters to get these guarantees that you're not going to have false positives at the end of this process. So we got some numbers here too. So Mozilla, from their website here, they had some cool data on how often is CRL light faster than OCSP. Hint, it's a lot. And we've also got this fun little visualization here where they've got this huge bar on this bar graph because the default OCSP timeout is 1,000 milliseconds. So that's why you see that, interesting distribution. Now you might ask yourself, if we are going to be doing certificate revocation locally, how much space does all this take up? So if you take your binary form of all unexpired certificate serial numbers, this was from Mozilla's data set that they were using when they were first creating this, and it comprises about 16 gigabytes worth of binary data. Now, if you take the hexadecimal form of all enrolled and compatible with CRL Lite unexpired certificate serial numbers, that comprises about 6.7 gigabytes on disk. Now, if you take your binary Bloom filter that they use for this compresses down to about 1.3 megabytes. As for the entire collection of certificates and the revocation data for which ones are revoked. And this averages out to being about 6.6 bits per revocation. So in December 2019, the numbers I was using for this slide here, that comprised 100 million certificates and 750,000 of those were revoked. So another question that might come to mind is, how fresh is the data? So the filter generation, I'm not sure how Mozilla defined modest hardware, but I'm going to guess that's nothing particularly fancy. And producing a final set of known revoked and known not revoked certificate serial numbers takes about 35 minutes. And then after that 35 minutes, that set of serial numbers is fed into their Bloom filter generator, which takes about 20 minutes. And they push out updates 4 times per day for this. So as a little summary here, you've got the speed, security, and privacy, pretty much all of which you can say CRL Lite does a vastly better job compared to OCSP. So, any questions? I was not looking at Discord, so I don't know how you guys take care of questions on this, but figured I would open up the floor.
No questions.
And if
What?
I was gonna say, is anyone muted and just, tried to ask and just wasn't heard?
Let's see here. Do we have any in the chat here? Yep. Nope.
Real quick, this is an easy question, though. I don't know that it has to do too much with the content, but where did you find that laser pointer?
It's built into PowerPoint.
Oh, using PowerPoint. Okay, I thought it was Discord. I was like, what? I'm missing out.
Oh, okay. I understand
Nice.
the misunderstanding there.
Right.
Got it. So I was looking while you were talking. I saw the revoked.grc.com site
Yes.
talking about Vivaldi and Firefox. So I downloaded Vivaldi to test it out, and it absolutely does not check it because
Oh no.
I went to the site in Vivaldi, and the revocation awareness test page popped up without a warning.
Well, that's unfortunate.
Yep.
I'm going to guess that Vivaldi either changed, their defaults for whether they use OCSP between, I think it was about 2017 or something when Gibson made that page, or it's possible that the OCSP that is turned on by default is failing open.
Could be.
I'm guessing that's probably not the case because Steve is a big fan of Digicert for his certificates, and I'm pretty sure they tend to do a good job of keeping their OCSP servers up, but that is worth investigating for my own curiosity.
Yeah, it was just something that I checked out. I'm actually now in the process. I cannot tell a lie. I am a simple creature. I am forced to use this evil Windows machine, and therefore I just utilize the Chromium browser that is built in, known as Edge.
Ew, gross.
It's just Chromium, man.
It's Chromium,
wrapper.
so it's not as bad as it could
Just
be.
a different wrapper, man. So, okay, I just downloaded Firefox. I'm now going to remote.grc.com. Ah, Firefox absolutely said it was a security risk. So
Excellent.
Firefox still doing the thing.
I know there is an optional setting in Firefox to make it more strict about that checking. Like if you don't get an OCSP response, it'll just not load the page for you.
Yep. But now we know, and all our viewers now, done by a test live on the spot while you're talking. Vivaldi, I'm sad to say, apparently is no longer, at least in my instance, a test of one absolutely did not stop me from going to that page, but Firefox did. And also, I was very, I'm sure there's a whole bunch of math involved in this, but their ability to compress is kind of the best word that comes to mind. The amount of disk space that those lists take is just mind-boggling to me.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And again, you can see just from getting an understanding of how these bloom filters work, it doesn't take many operations to check with them either.
Yeah. So that's super cool. So how do we make it?
Fun stuff.
How do we make it the standard?
Well, I imagine part of that will be when Mozilla gets it out to production.
Sure.
And pushes it out to all users instead of just nightly and or beta.
Got it.
But
yeah.
I imagine we'll get there soon, and then my hope is that other browsers and even other systems that need to deal with certificate revocation checking outside of browsers will hopefully use a similar system because, like I mentioned, with real-world examples of revoked certificates being used, I mean, ransomware loaders can bring a revoked certificate and use that for nefarious purposes.
Truth. And I have to say, I'm very disappointed. So I am a GRC guy, and I saw this grc.com site, and so now I just looked at www.grc.com, And sadly, well, not sadly, it is what it is. It leads to Gibson Research Corporation and not governance risk compliance.
Well, do you know when that term was coined?
GRC, I don't know, man.
I don't
But
either.
based
That's
on
why
the
I'm asking.
appearance of this website, I could say that it may have been after this was created.
That would be my guess. You also got to keep in mind too that Steve writes basically almost everything that he does for software and assembly, including his
Yeah,
web
sure.
server, if
Well,
I'm not
that's awesome.
mistaken. So
Got it. Well, when's the next roller coaster tycoon coming out, man?
Roller Coaster Tycoon, what?
It was a game written entirely in assembly.
Oh shoot, I forgot about that bit of trivia.
Yep. Very cool. By one dude. One Mr. Chris Sawyer.
Impressive.
Quite impressive.
Game
So B,
programming is hard enough. Sorry,
I
go
had
ahead.
I had a question. I
Go
don't know
for
if
it.
you can go back on the graph that you mentioned that shows OSCP being slower than the Bloom filter.
Yeah,
I
give me a second. I'll switch back to that slide. One sec here.
mhm.
Yeah, the Mozilla numbers here. Yeah, so were you wanting to look at the bar graph or the pie chart?
at
Point out.
the bar graph. Yeah, I didn't quite understand it much.
Yeah, my apologies. So what they are graphing here is how much
Hmm.
faster than OCSP CRL Lite is when it comes to checking revocation. So the vertical axis here is the percentage increase, and then this is excuse me, no, this is a percentage of reports. My bad. I was looking at the wrong axis. And then the x-axis here, you've got your speed up versus OCSP in milliseconds. And then, as mentioned, you have this really crazy outlier here on the far end at 1,000 milliseconds because OCSP times out then.
Ah, I got it. Okay. All right.
Any other questions?
Do you think this will be implemented on Chromium browsers and will become
Eventually,
like a
probably.
standard?
At least to me, as an engineer, the benefits are so compelling that I don't see any reason they wouldn't. The only potential reason I could think of that they might not is if they're worried about, Mozilla trying to extract some value from their design, but I don't feel like Mozilla would do that. I suspect that they would rather other organizations and software use the same technique and get the benefits, because everyone's going to benefit, users and otherwise.
All right.
Yeah, that's. Oh, Mozilla does cool things.
Yep, that they do.
You could say otherwise, given the recently controversial private policy claims.
Sorry, what was that?
No, that I'm just mentioning the recent private policy claims controversy that they had.
Oh, with Mozilla?
Yeah.
Are you
Yeah, they
talking about
removed their guarantee of selling that they won't sell user data. Pretty much.
Ah, okay, yeah. I remember that going around when that happened. Unfortunate, but I guess I'm not exactly surprised. They got to pay their bills somehow, but it's unfortunate they'd go to selling user data. My hope would be that they would, sell information about users in such a way that's the least privacy invasive possible. But if it comes down to it, there's also forks of Firefox out there.
Indeed.
I hope it doesn't affect too much uh, like how do you say, like the use that we have currently with Firefox.
Hmm.
I hope it doesn't become outdated because people are really privacy focused. So if they like, so if Mozilla gave them like a distrust of that, then it's possible that the usage of Firefox is gonna tank.
That's possible,
Yeah,
certainly.
I miss the days when Firefox was almost the majority browser for a little while.
Really, when was it a popular browser?
I'd have to double check. I think it was at least as far back as around 2010,
Yeah,
2012
really, it
ballpark,
was
but
before
it's
Chrome.
been a while. Oh,
Ah, I
was it?
see.
Okay, or maybe early days of Chrome.
Yeah, the very early days of Chrome. Um, it used to be the competition, obviously, between Internet Explorer and Firefox. Then Chrome came on the scene and sort of just dominated everything from there. Anywho, well, Obi-Wan, thank you so much for this highly informative presentation and changing my opinion on which browser I should use by default. Um, I appreciate that. You know, I should have known just going back to Firefox would be a smart move, but I gotta be honest, I'm lazy and I hate Windows anyway. So, hey, here we are. If nothing else, I got that out of it. And I learned about this very, very cool new technology that was Lowe's development. So thanks. I appreciate it.